Okay, so hi everybody. First of all, I apologize. The talk is called Valence matching, not voice matching. Okay, so I'll be talking about valence matching in Saliba. Okay, so here's the problem. In complex verbs in Saliba, all verbs have to be either intransitive or transitive. So in one, you can see two simple intransitive, sorry. In two, you can see two simple transitives. And in three, you can see a simple and a derived transitive. So derived transitivity is always indicated by underlining, and again in four, okay? So I'm gonna propose that matching results from an operation of type symmetric event composition. Okay, this is my outline. I'll briefly go through the basics of Saliba, then I'll talk about valence matching as found in complex verbs. I'll run through my analysis and briefly venture outside of Saliba before concluding. Okay, so Saliba is an oceanic language spoken in Papua New Guinea. It's SOV and largely head final. We have subject and object agreement. And what's relevant are two factors. First of all, it's a fundamentally intransitive language, meaning that most verbal roots require derivation in order to be able to have objects. And second, it has rigid transitivity, meaning that transitive verbs always have to take their objects, or at least have object suffixes. You can usually drop objects. Okay, so let me just give you a few non-complex verb examples. So in 5, you have a simple intransitive sentence. In 6, a simple transitive, I saw them. You have two very productive valence increasing operations, the applicative, first of all, in 7. So you can have he carried and he carried them. And also the causative, as in 8, it's 30 versus she made it 30. Okay, now valence decreasing operations, while available, they're highly unproductive. Okay, so returning to complex verbs. Complex verbs involve the combination of 2 to 4 verbs, most of which occur independently, okay? Complex verbs are compact, so no material can occur between verbs. In terms of the commonly drawn distinctions, these would be classified as nuclear layer serial verb constructions. And we have, giving you the general schema in 9, we have one set of agreement affixes to the left and to the right of the complex verb respectively. Okay, so what's interesting is that in complex verbs, all verbs has to be either intransitive or transitive. So in 10, we have two simple intransitives. He jumped down. And in 11, we have two transitives. Where is this? Sorry. He hit, broke them. Okay, so whenever we have a mismatch, it's the intransitive verb that has to be transitive. As recall that valence decreasing operations are no longer aren't productive in the language. So this is achieved via the causative or the applicative. In 12, we have a transitive verb hit and an intransitive verb fall. And if you want to combine these, you have to transitivize the second one with the causative, meaning he made it fall down. And similarly in 13, I've given you an example with an applicative. So we have gabai throw and dobi go down. You want to stick those in a complex verb together, you have to applicativize the second one. Okay, he threw it down. Okay, 14 is just to show you that both verbs can be derived transitive. So we have heyuli and hege. Hegehe derived from sink and finish respectively. You can make both of them transitive and combine them into a complex verb, meaning I will draw on all of them. And 15 is just to show you that you cannot have an intransitive V1 combined with a transitive V2. So if you want to say something like she broke it by dancing, for example, a table, you would have to resort to a coordination construction. Okay. Okay, so I don't really have time to go into the positional slots. All that's relevant is that you can have up to 4 verbs, with the first slot denoting the main event or the means, depending on how you analyze it, and the second slot denoting the main event or the result. The third slot has a directional meaning, and the fourth slot expresses manner or phrasal modification. Okay. And these don't all have to co-occur. You can have like a VA and a VC combination or VA and a VD combination, but the order is fixed. Okay, so just to give you all some context, I'm looking at Saliba. So Saliba is one of my case studies in my dissertation where I look at voice and transitivity restrictions in complex verbs. And so we do find something interesting in these things. We find what I call contextual transitivity. So what's going on is that a handful of verbs in the VD slot cannot be transitive in isolation. For example, be good, be slow, be quick, or return, which has a variety of meanings. These verbs have to be intransitive in isolation, but once you stick them in a complex verb, they must, under certain conditions, transitivize exceptional. Okay. So, for example, uyo, which means return, and nam would be good. Ban objects in isolation, as you can see in 16 and 17, sorry. But once you transitivise them, these become ill-formed. Note that 16b and 17b are constructed. Anna Margits does explicitly say which verbs can and cannot be transitive in isolation, but she doesn't give any ill-formed examples. Okay, but these guys have to be transitive in the context of a transitive preceding verb. So, for example, in 18, our V1 is heyoli, which means cause to sink, and we want to combine it with uyo, which means return, or again in this context, and then uyo exceptionally transitivizes via the applicative. This exceptional transitivity never occurs via the causative. Okay, and I'll get back to that later. So what's interesting is that there's a mismatch between a verb's general and specific morphosyntactic potential, which is interesting independently because my impression is that usually it's the other way around. Once you stick something in a serial verb construction, a verb tends to lose some of its potential, either morphosyntactically or semantically, right? So here it's the other way around. This is a recurring property of Oceanic complex verbs, by the way, and I'll give you a couple more examples. Okay. Okay. So now I'll briefly talk about headedness. Now it's the final verb which determines the object's sortal properties, okay? So for example, if we have the verb ini, which means pour, in isolation, its object denotes the thing which is poured in. In the case of 20, that's the tea. But once you stick it in a complex verb as a V1, and you combine it with the verb fill, the object of the complex is the cup, which denotes the thing filled, okay? So I take this to mean that Vn is the syntactic head in that it's the one whose object is realized, is the one that's realized, okay? Okay, these are going to be my assumptions. So Vn is going to be the syntactic head. Any preceding verbs we can think of as V-level adjuncts or modifiers. Semantically, complex verbs involve event accumulation, and the matching itself is going to result from type-sensitive event composition. Okay, and crucially, objects are going to be added. Are going to be added after complex verb formation. There is some precedent for this. For example, in Hubert Heider's work on restructuring, or in Alexander Williams' work on resultatives. Okay, and these two assumptions are fairly standard. Agents are introduced by voice, and patients I take to be lexical arguments of the verb. Okay, so as discussed in work by Malte Zimmermann and Maria Maici, serial verb constructions, despite being formally similar, can actually be very heterogeneous semantically. For Saliba, I'm going to assume that complex verb involve event accumulation. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, you can see this in 22. There's a macro event which I'm calling big E, which in turn consists of two sub-events E1 and E2, and these two are symmetrically related via accumulator. And then you have two event predicates. Okay. We can rule out certain other construals, such as predicate modification, because predicate modification would express the existence of a single event with multiple event predicates, as in 23. Now, if we do this, it will be impossible to distinguish patients or objects as functions of distinct sub-events, right? So we saw in example 24, for the cup full, the object that's realized is the thing which is filled and not the thing which is poured. So these are non-identical, okay? And as far as I can tell, predicate modification wouldn't be able to give us this result. Okay, I'm going to assume that matching and complex verb formation follows from event composition, which I take to be type sensitive. So ECTS takes two predicates P and Q of like types as input. It co-indexes the internal arguments of P and Q if we have a transitive, and it existentially binds all of P's arguments because those can no longer be realized in any way. And it requires the arguments of the second predicate combines with as input. So 25 is going to be ECTS for intransitives, and 26 is going to be ECTS for transitives, and this characterizes the generalized operation in 27. Okay, I'll run through a couple derivations in a moment. Okay, so why am I doing this? Well, as far as I can see, valence matching does not follow from a main general property of the language. There are certain factors that correlate with valence matching, but then again, most languages that have these ingredients, such as nuclear layer composition, rigid transitivity, etc., seem to lack it. And So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to tie the matching to complex verb formation itself. Okay. And it seems that we need some degree of parametrization independently. For example, some languages have nuclear layer SVCs, others have core layer SVCs, some have both. Okay, let's run. How am I doing on time, by the way? Is there like a timer here somewhere?
There's a timer in the audience. You have about 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so let's run through an intransitive example. We have the complex verb in 28, which means he jumped down. We have two verbs, composi. There's a jumping event, and dobi. There's a going down event. These are both the type ST, right? You stick composi into ECTS, which gives you 30A. And because our first input has been of type ST, the second input Q has to be of type ST also. And then our next step, we've stuck go down into this operator, and then in the next step, we existentially close off the event of the event argument of the first event. Okay. And then in 31, because there are no longer any individual arguments left to saturate, we do existential closure. And then this is where the accumulation comes in, which is needed independently because certain operators like TM and negation target the whole complex. You can't modify any sub-events of the whole complex. And of course, we also, as in 31C, want to relate the agent to the entire event. Okay. So this slide basically repeats the most important steps in the derivation I just gave you. So we started with jump, and then we combine it with the operator ECTS, and then we combine it with go down. This gives us 33B, and then we do existential closure because we don't have any individual arguments left. This gives us 33C, and this in turn gives us 34, he jumped and went down, which roughly translates to he jumped down. That was an intransitive example. Let's do a transitive case. So in 35, we have the sentence, he hit broke them. We have, now in this case, we have two predicates of type EST. We have koi, which means there's a hitting event with patient X, and we have break, KC, which means there is a breaking event with patient Y. Okay, so we put koi into our function or operation, which means that the second predicate Q will also have to be of type EST. We do that in 37B, and then we do co-indexation because we have transitives, right? So we co-index it to arguments, and then we close off all the arguments of our first predicate P, right? And the result is going to be 37D. And then we proceed with function application of the object, dum, in 38A, which means we only have an event variable left. We existentially close that. We do event accumulation as in 38C, and then we add the agent, and this gives us the desired result in 39, he hit and broke them, he hit broke them. Okay, so this is the tree. I've just repeated the most important steps. Yeah, I think this should be fairly clear. Okay. So in case we have a complex verb with non-shared objects, as in 42, pour the cup full, I'm assuming that co-indexation of internal arguments fails, and that the object of the first predicate V1, P, respectively V1, remains implicit. And I asked Anna Margits, and she said that the object cannot be realized as an optional oblique. So you cannot say something like pour the cup full in brackets with T. Okay. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. So recall that the contextually transitive cases were the ones where we have a transitive V1 combined with a verb, which is strictly intransitive in isolation, but once you combine the two, the latter verb exceptionally transitivizes. So we have heyoli, which is cause to sing, and uyo, which is return. You stick those together, uyo exceptionally becomes a transitive. Okay. Well, to ensure this, we need to make sure that the trigger, which is the transitive cause sync, must be present before the target. Okay. Otherwise, the context for exceptional transitivization would not be given. And I propose that this follows from my operation of ECTS, which never attaches to the main projection line, but rather makes a verbal adjunct out of a verb, right? So let's run through this. So ECTS takes cause sync as its first argument, as in 47A, which in turn requires the second predicate Q to be also of type EST. Now, to be a well-formed second argument to ECTS, return has to exceptionally shift from ST to EST. I take this to happen via the operator add, which adds a dummy argument to return, as you can see in 47B and C respectively. Okay. Now this gives us the desired result of two type symmetric predicates combined into a complex one. What now happens is we proceed with function application of it, leaving only the event argument of the latter predicate, and then we add the agent and do event accumulation, and this gives us we sync it and return, which roughly translates to we again make it sync. Okay, so this is going to be the tree, and this is going to be the context necessary for triggering the exceptional transitivization of return of the intransitive verb. Okay, hope that wasn't too fast. Okay, so there's a couple predictions. So first of all, matching is due to a local binary operation. This correctly predicts across the board matching with more than 2 verbs. So if you combine 3 verbs, you get across the board matching. We have here 1 simple transitive and 2 derived transitive. I'll draw on all of them. And you can also have up to 4 verbs combined with a transitive, labile, and a derived transitive verb, as in 52. Okay. If matching, say, were simply the need for the final verb in the series to somehow license an object, we would only predict matching to surface on the final verb. Instead, we get it across the board. And second, matching is sensitive to valence, not transitivity, which correctly predicts that transitive but, and intransitive but bivalent verbs can combine. So for example, in 53, we have the verb lao. And once we stick lao in a complex verb as the final verb, with the verb look at, I assume these are both EST, and this is fine. And note that 54A also shows that it's the final verb, which determines how the object of the complex is realized, because this guy here is oblique. Okay, so he's looking over to his friend. And conversely, in 54B, when you have lao as a V1, so when lao is not the head, but rather the transitive verb gabai, it's the final verb here which forces the object to be realized structurally. And again, I'm assuming these are both EST and EST. That's why I call it valence matching and not matching. Okay, let's see. 3 minutes. Okay, so briefly venturing outside Saliba. So when we look at To'abaita, which is also an Oceanic language, we see that in complex verbs, when V1 is transitive and V2 intransitive, the object is realized oblique, as you can see in 55. Okay, so you have eat and be big or be much, and the object of the complex is oblique. Right? But when V2 is also transitive, as in 56, the object is realized structurally. So in 56, I severed the wine by biting it. Musi, sever, is transitive, and that's why the object of the complex is a direct object. Okay. So I think it makes sense to talk about contextual transitivity, or in the case of To'abaita, bivalence, as a morphosyntactic repair. So I take repairs to be properties which are illicit in the general case, but under certain conditions become well-formed, right? And I think it's useful to think of this in sort of like an OT way, even though I'm not sure whether OT is the way I'll actually go. So first of all, there's a conflict. We need to realize an object, but the verb we want to realize that object with is intransitive. Okay, so this leads to a conflict, and then we have to decide on the type of repair. Well, we can either realize the object or not realize it at all. Okay, so both languages choose to realize the object. And then we can talk about the shape of the repair, right, which I take to be a PF choice, which in Saliba is structural, but in To'abaita is oblique. Okay. And so if these are actually repairs, well, these should actually be very general mechanisms, right? So the applicative A is actually Saliba's most generic transitivized. And the preposition ana is actually To'abaita's most generic oblique marker for position. Okay. Okay, so I have 1 minute left. Okay, so let's see. So contextual transitivity is a systematically recurring property in Oceanic. I've given you a Dakaka example in 57. I'm guessing that this is due to the need to realize the object of a preceding transitive verb sort of indirectly via co-indexation with a dummy argument. In general, it seems that the combination transitive verb plus intransitive verb is the most restricted one. And for Saliba, at least, this suggests that complex verb formation might actually be layered in that there's one component which gives you matching, and there's another component which gives you contextual transitivity. Okay. So I don't really have the time to go through this. I'll just quickly run through this. So In terms of domain, so descriptions of SVCs in other languages aren't as detailed as for Saliba, but it does seem that matching is typically found in more cohesive domains. So for example, we have a PAMIS example. In 58, we have a case of what's called ambient serialization. So we have an object surfacing between the two verbs, and we don't get any transitivization of the second verb. But once you have a nuclear layer serial verb construction where nothing can surface between the two verbs, you get exceptional transitivization of the latter verb, okay? And in this case, both the structural and oblique options are possible. I'll just quickly conclude. Okay, so valence matching in Saliba, I've proposed follows from type symmetric event composition at the V level. Contextual transitivity, I propose, is a type of morphosyntactic repair. The apparent ingredients for matching, as far as I can see, include rigid transitivity, cohesive morphosyntactic domains, and a certain type of semantic and syntactic composition. Open issues include the cross-linguistic distribution of matching, other modes of achieving matching. I have some thoughts on this, and relation to other phenomena such as resultatives and transitivity agreement. For example, we have some languages where auxiliaries co-vary with the main verbs. Transitivity. Okay, that was it. Thank you.
All right. So we have about 9 minutes for questions. Vera?
Thanks for the talk. Sorry, a bit slow. So I do have, it's a small technical comment, but if you go back to slide 19, so that I feel like, yeah, maybe let's look at the slide and then it might be easier to follow along. So, I mean, the event accumulation, strictly speaking, is not defined, right? Because you've already quantified off both E1 and E2. So these variables are no longer accessible at this stage. So I think the event accumulation would have to actually apply before these two arguments are closed off, which might or might not be possible in your derivation.
That's true, that's the problem, yeah.
Yeah, so 31b, right? That's the issue, that technically in terms of the bracketing, the part where you have the big E equals E1 accumulated with E2, that should be outside of the two brackets of the two individual existential quantifiers. So these could be random other events. Yeah, it's just a remark on the technical implementation that you might have to fiddle around a little bit with, because I do.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, my other question is a data question that's actually related, right? Because you, of course, the event accumulation, if I understood you correctly, you need that to get the temporal interpretation of these things right? Because if you just do cumulation, that will always be interpreted at the same time. But if you were to just existentially quantify them off, I think the lower event would potentially be allowed to be temporally independent. And I wonder if that's such a bad prediction, or if that maybe you don't need the accumulation in the end, depending on what the data actually are. Looking at 28, I don't even see a temporal aspectual marker in that sentence. So if it's a tenseless language, maybe that's not an issue.
Right, thanks for the comment. So unfortunately, I was unable to do field work on this. I tried, but there were many reasons that unfortunately made it impossible. So I've been a bit sloppy. So strictly speaking, I mean, the main reason, so I'm actually agnostic as to what the exact relation is between these two events. I somehow need them to form a cohesive unit, right? Because things like TAM and negation can only target the whole complex, but you can't target individual sub-events. And the other reason I did this was I needed to distinguish E1 and E2, right? So one of the reasons I'm going for this is because I don't want predicate modification, precisely because of cases like 24. Right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but the example, like pouring the cup full, are these events really happening at the same time? I mean, 24, I mean, I wonder if the temporal trace of these two events, I mean, one is the result of the of the other event. So there is a temporal ordering.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, with verbs in these very tight morphosyntactic domains, things, as far as I can tell, rarely happen at the exactly same time.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be more of an independent property. And but yeah, at the moment I can't really tell. So I'm trying to make the analysis as specific as possible, as necessary for Saliba, but also as general as possible, because this is just a case study, but in my dissertation, the chapter I actually look at matching in other languages as well.
Nice. I mean, yeah, without this specific analysis, you don't have any predictions. So
right.
In a way, good thing. And I'm sure Jens will have more questions in the same direction. I see he has just posted, raised his hand in the chat.
Yeah, probably, yeah. Thanks.
So I think Jens was next.
Hey, hi Mike, thanks for the nice talk.
Hi, Jens.
It's very interesting to see the new stuff. I have a comment on event cumulation as well, because it's also discussed in the Zimmermann and Amechi work, is that under event cumulation, you would expect them to be symmetric, right? Because you don't have an ordering relation between them. But as far as you presented the data on Saliba, is that you have fixed slots, and these slots tell you something about the symmetry or asymmetry of the events, I guess. So I think when you have like a hitting filling event in this direction, it's clear that the pouring filling event, it's clear that the pouring causes or is the filling of the cup. But I guess you cannot have it vice versa, something like to fill pure the cup or whatever object it can be. So you might need something that, at least for these cases, the result cases, to ensure that they are asymmetric, because event cumulation is not. And another question, I don't know. If you want to say something on this, but it was just more than a comment.
No, it's fine. Go on.
The other question is, why do you think that the different intransitive predicates in transitive complex verbs have different repair mechanisms in a way? So why do some take the cause morpheme, especially in the cause-result combination, and others take the applicative or transitive morpheme? And then maybe related to that, you showed us examples where you can have more than one causative morpheme, but can you also have more than one applicative morpheme within a complex verb?
Right, those are very good questions. So I'll tackle the second one first. Can you have more than one applicative? No, so I think I have this here in my notes. So applicative, I hate this. Applicative can only surface on the final verb in the complex. I have no idea why. But coming back to your first question, which is about the distribution of causative and applicative, right? So I'm not sure I got you right. The repair, or what I call the repair, was always via the applicative. Okay, it's never via the causative. Okay. And I think this is consistent with the fact that the applicative in Saliba, at least, is like a very generic transitive bias where you can introduce all sorts of objects, close objects, remote objects, addressees, locations, whatnot. More generally with respect to the distribution of the causative in these 4 slots, this is still work in progress. So some verbs can independently not be transitivized via the causative or applicative respectively. So I can rule out a subset of these, but many actually still escape the net. And I don't really know why. I have a few thoughts on this, but at the moment it's too speculative. If you have any ideas, I'd be happy to hear them.
Maybe one idea on the applicative, because this is also related to Koppel's talk, actually, I think tomorrow or day after tomorrow, because I was actually thinking with the same on the DACA data I'm working on, is that the applicative marker is maybe actually like just a transitive marker, or actually just a spell out of voice. And I think Koppel's talk goes in the same direction. And this would then, like if voice goes on top of the whole complex verb, then this, what you call a repair, would maybe just be the single voice ahead on top of the complex predicate. It's like a whole different way you could interpret this applicative morpheme. So it's not related really to the last verb, but to the whole complex verb, because it's always in the final position of the complex verb.
Right. I think I remember you mentioning this idea once. To be honest, I don't know if that works because, let me see. The fact that this is an applicative, or more generally even the fact that this verb is unable to be transitive, is a function of this verb in particular, right? It's a property of this verb, and that doesn't seem to be a property of the whole complex. So did I get your point wrong?
So if we imagine that the applicative marker is something like the spell out of little v or voice here, so the way higher, so it's related to the whole verb, then you just mark the transitivity for the complex verb and not the transitivity for the second verb.
I'd have to think about it, but if I understood you correctly, that might also explain why I can only have the applicative once, right?
Yes.
I see.
Exactly.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I'll think about it. Thanks a lot.